Welcome to Criminal Law Video Presentation Number 8. This presentation will discuss voluntary manslaughter, both voluntary manslaughter at common law and manslaughter under the Model Penal Code. Let's start with common law voluntary manslaughter. The elements of voluntary manslaughter at common law are the intentional killing in a sudden heat of passion brought on by adequate provocation before a reasonable cooling time, and all tied together with a causal connection between the killing, the passion, and the provocation. We will discuss a number of these elements in the next few minutes. Let's begin with intentional killing. If you remember, at common law, murder was the unlawful causing the death of another human being with malice aforethought. And then malice aforethought, which has no meaning in and of itself, is one of four elements, and one of those was intentional killing. So now murder has an intentional killing. And if there is an intentional killing, if you remember from the last video session, I said if there's an intentional killing, we need to go on and examine if there is first-degree murder, which can be an intentional killing with premeditation and deliberation. Now we learn that if there is an intentional killing, we have to go on and examine voluntary manslaughter. And the reason we have to do this is that all three of these offenses, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter, all contain an intentional killing. For that reason, I always suggest that any analysis of murder and first-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter begin with an analysis of murder at common law, or what today in most jurisdictions would be second-degree murder, to determine if there is an intentional killing. Because if there is not an intentional killing, we won't have first-degree murder, and we cannot have voluntary manslaughter. So intentional killing is the element, the mens rea element, that ties all three of these offenses together. And therefore, if you were to determine that there is an intentional killing, our analysis would require a discussion of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter. So let's begin looking at some of the elements of voluntary manslaughter. As we said, first, an intentional killing. It has to be in the heat of passion, and this has to be an excitable state on behalf of the defendant. It can't be calm, cool reflection. This is something where the defendant is highly excited. The middle of an argument, voices are raised, something that would indicate that the defendant's reasoning has been thrown off by this heat of passion. And it has to be brought on by adequate provocation. And some of the courts discuss this as provocation is such that it would arouse a sudden and intense passion in the mind of an ordinary, reasonable person and cause him to lose self-control. So it had to be, this defendant had to be provoked. It's something that had to arouse a sudden and intense passion in this defendant, and would be something that would do so in a reasonable person. So it's both, again here we see a subjective and objective analysis. Now over time, the common law courts have taken a look at what is adequate provocation and have categorized adequate provocation based on a number of things, and you'll see courts discuss these all the time. Extreme assault or battery upon the defendant will be deemed to be adequate provocation. Mutual combat, again, will be deemed to be adequate provocation. Likewise, the defendant's arrest, injury or serious abuse to a close relative of the defendant, and finally, sudden discovery of a spouse's adultery will be deemed adequate provocation. Some jurisdictions require that this adultery be discovered in the actual act of committing the adultery. Others will permit learning of the adultery even though they do not find their spouse in the actual act to be sufficient to be adequate provocation. Most jurisdictions today do not find mere words to be enough to be adequate provocation. But again, there are always exceptions, and there are some jurisdictions that will permit mere words to be adequate provocation. Now, the fourth element is a reasonable cooling time. That is, it is a subjective and objective test. Did this defendant cool off? So whatever time period there was, did this defendant cool off in that time period? If the defendant did, then there is no defense or no claim of voluntary manslaughter. And secondly, would a reasonable person have cooled off in the time period? And both of these questions need to be answered, because in reality, voluntary manslaughter is often raised as a defense to first or second degree murder. It is a claim that there was something that excited the defendant's passions and that it should be permitted to reduce either first degree or second degree murder to voluntary manslaughter, which is often punished in a lesser way than first or second degree murder. Now let's take a look briefly at the Model Penal Code. The Model Penal Code handles manslaughter slightly differently. First of all, it creates two different categories of manslaughter. The first one is reckless killing. It makes a causing the death of another recklessly manslaughter. And secondly, and this is the one that looks a lot like common law voluntary manslaughter, it's causing the death of another which would otherwise be murder is committed under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance for which there is a reasonable explanation or excuse. Now you will notice a number of things here that are different than voluntary manslaughter at common law. First of all, the death does not have to be intentional, or purposely. It could be done knowingly or recklessly manifesting an extreme indifference to human life, or even just recklessly. Finally, there is no cooling time here. There is no time period that is required in order for it to be manslaughter. And in fact, Model Penal Code manslaughter recognizes the concept that the extreme mental or emotional disturbance could be developed over a significant period of time and doesn't need to be sudden or immediate. And finally, there is no limitation here as to whether conduct or words will cause the extreme mental or emotional disturbance. Either one of them might be sufficient to bring about the mental state that is needed for manslaughter under the Model Penal Code. Finally, the reasonableness of the explanation or excuse is determined from the viewpoint of a person in the actor's situation under circumstances as he believes them to be. This makes this a more subjective evaluation of the reasonableness. Now, it still has to be reasonable. This is still an objective evaluation. So is the extreme mental or emotional disturbance. Is that a reasonable, based on a reasonable excuse? But the various specifics of the defendant are brought into play in this situation. We will discuss all of these factors much more in class, but this is just a very brief introduction to common law voluntary manslaughter and Model Penal Code manslaughter. This concludes this video session, and as always, you need to go to the Twin site and fill out the assessment for this video presentation. Thank you.